Good morning, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure, both personally and professionally, to introduce Lucilla Byrne this morning. She's an old friend of the department. Lucilla is a keeper of Greek and Roman, of antiquities in general, which includes at the Fitzwilliam in the ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian. She trained the best of both worlds, both at Cambridge and at Oxford, where we were together for many years at the Ashmolean. And she worked under John Boardman, working on the late 5th century painter, the Medias painter, and you will all be familiar with her monograph. Lucilla has subsequently worked at the British Museum for many years as assistant keeper, and was in a way the bridge to the present, from Higgins to the present keepership, taking care of really finishing the great work of the volumes of terracotta, which is a painstakingly arduous work, the great third volume, which she oversaw after Higgins passed away. And it was a great achievement. She's also worked extensively on publishing monographs on Greek myths, and also both handbooks to the Fitzwilliam and to the BM, and wonderful compendium of Hellenistic art that we've all benefited from. On a more personal note, we are grateful to Lucilla in 2006, I think, when she spent a good time here at the Met, really helping us sort out our own terracottas, which had never really been looked at since Miss Richter in the 40s and 50s, and guiding us as to which pieces should be on view and which pieces should be looked at more carefully. All in all, she's a wonderful colleague, the most pleasant of persons to work with, and apart from many other duties at the Fitzwilliam, what she has been focusing on till last year was basically the whole reinstallation of the classical collections, Greek and Roman, at the Fitzwilliam. And what she has very gracefully accepted to address us this morning is to give us a resume of the reinstallation of the Greek and Roman collections. And we thank you, Lucilla. Welcome.
Thank you, Carlos, for that very kind introduction. And I'd like to start by thanking you again, and also Joan Mertens for, can you hear me at the back? For very kindly inviting me to talk here, and also Nicole Leist and all her colleagues in the public and exhibitions program section, who've been so very helpful in making all the arrangements. It's a huge pleasure and a great privilege and honour to be here today. I'll just move on to the next slide. This is a view of our recently reinstalled Greek and Roman gallery at the Fitzwilliam. But I do have to say that, as I rather anticipated, that coming from England to the United States, from Cambridge to New York, and from the Fitzwilliam to the Met, it is difficult not to feel rather small. The Fitzwilliam's collection of Greek and Roman antiquities is, along with that of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the most significant and extensive in the United Kingdom outside London. And we do have many treasures. Here you see a couple of them. But while size isn't everything, one can't escape the fact that whereas here at the Met you have more than 17,000 Greek and Roman objects, we have around 6,000. And I have to say that, having spent some time wandering around here yet again, I'm probably just as envious of the amount of space you have here. I understand here you can boast around 6,000 square meters of display space, and we have rather fewer than 300. Despite all this, I maintain, keeping my spirits up, that our collections do have quite a lot in common. As many of you, perhaps all of you will know, this Roman sarcophagus was the very first object, I understand, acquired by the Met in 1870. And while our founding collection, as I'll be explaining, contained no antiquities at all, this, our very finest Roman sarcophagus, was the first one of the first objects that we were given in 1835, where it arrived in Cambridge courtesy of the British Navy. I'll be coming back to it shortly. And there are many overlaps between both between the content of our collections. It's not just sarcophagi, but bone couches, where we both have more or less daringly restored versions of these. Unhappily, we just have one end, whereas you have a more complete version, but there you go. Both our collections contain objects which derive ultimately from the Lansdowne collection. This was a collection which was put together by the first Marquis of Lansdowne, largely in 1770, in the 1770s, for the collection he was forming for his newly built house at Lansdowne House in Berkeley Square in London. On the right, Hermes in the Met's collection. On the left, one of the great treasures in our collection, head of Antiquities, the lover of the Emperor Hadrian, shown in the guise of the Greek god Dionysus. Of course, here you have the whole dining room from Lansdowne House. I believe this was shipped here in the 1930s when the front half of Lansdowne House was demolished in order to widen the road so that buses could more conveniently pass around Berkeley Square, and various parts of the collection at that time ended up on this side of the Atlantic. However, we are very lucky in that we've had on loan for some years this very beautiful, well, interesting perhaps rather than beautiful, black marble relief, which, as this watercolour of the late 18th century shows, was designed by the Marquis of Lansdowne to be built into the fireplace as a sort of mantelpiece in what was at times originally going to be a library and eventually became a sculpture gallery and in a later incarnation a ballroom at Lansdowne House. And we've had this on loan for about 10 years. And this is it. It's an intriguing, perhaps rather than beautiful, object. It has three mythological scenes: Odysseus sailing past the Sirens, Dionysus, the wine god, bringing the gift of wine across the sea, and the Argonauts with Stymphalian birds. I'm afraid you can't see it very well here, and intriguing smaller scenes of pygmies or erotes hunting in a marshy landscape above, and a marine scene below, real and fantastic sea animals. Both the relief and our Antinous head came from Tivoli, the Emperor Hadrian's villa outside Rome. And we've been fortunate enough to be able to buy the Lansdowne relief now. We're hoping to be able to spend more time working out, trying to establish where at Tivoli it came from. We've also got other research in hand, trying to work out exactly what the stone is. It's often been described rather casually as Biggio Morato, and we're trying to work out whether it was actually from Italy or from Turkey. And we've also found some traces of pigment on the relief, which we're having analysed. So it's very gratifying to feel that we can keep it now in the collection, keep it in England, one small bit of the Lansdowne collection that's not coming west, and we'll be able to work on it and hopefully pass on more information about it to the public in due course. And of course, as my reverting to my title, if you have centaurs like this beautiful one, well, so do we. So there we are. Beyond the content of our collections and the at times haphazard or serendipitous way in which these have developed and grown in both our institutions, there are also similarities, I think, in some ways between the neo-elegance of most of our display spaces, which is absolutely wonderful in many ways for a classical collection, as you've shown so beautifully in the installation of the galleries here. And we also have a forest of columns to contend with. And although they are wonderful, and of course this is a very fine, our building is a very fine neoclassical building, it does in some ways restrict what you can do. And I'm afraid we have to some extent ended up with a slightly crowded arrangement in parts, but we hope it works to a large extent. There are also parallels in the way that we try to present and explain the collections to our various audiences, as well as in our endeavours to research the collections and pass on new insights to our visitors. And I'll be touching on some of these points this morning. But I thought in discussing our new display and our collections, I would launch my introduction to our collection with a single slightly eccentric object that I'm fairly confident is something you don't have a bigger and better example of here. And this object is known for fairly obvious reasons as the Roman Swiss Army knife. It's a very beautiful multi-tool. It's made entirely in silver, apart from its iron knife blade. And it consists of a combination of 6 implements, most of which seem to be designed for use in eating. The implements are all hinged or riveted onto a flat handle, which is made of a single strip of silver, which is folded into here. It's bent double, and the central part is cut to a lyre shape with openwork designs. And the principal hinge at the left-hand end holds a shank with the bowl of a spoon on one end and a fork on the other. The base of the fork is also cut into the shape of a lyre. At the other end of the handle are 2 rivets, one of which holds the knife blade, and the other 3 small implements, a round-headed spatula, just a tapering pick, and a leaf-shaped pick here. And presumably there's also this little projection which is quite handy. It helps you to lever out those 3 smaller implements. In the centre of the handle is a small flat knob here, which fits through the lyre of the fork, and when you turn it you can lock the fork against the handle so it doesn't get in your way while you use the spoon. And although the knife blade has corroded, the other parts do all still move, and you can get them in and out. We're also very lucky in that we have a beautiful silver replica, which is very handy and which our volunteers can use to show to the public, and we can actually get things in and out, including the knife blade, on that. While we can't be certain about the precise function of the 3 small implements, it seems likely that they could all have found a use at the table. I have to say personally I've always found this object both frustrating and appealing. It's frustrating to me as an archaeologist because I can't say where it comes from. Its history, I'm afraid, doesn't go back beyond 1970. Nor can I be at all definite about where or when it was made. The closest of the very few known parallels that we have was found in a tomb at Ventimiglia in northern Italy. So Italy could be a possibility. This is the Ventimiglia example, which has not been terribly well published. It's a deluxe model, even more so than ours, because it has all 6 things that we have, but it also has a little strainer as well. So you could pour wine into your wine cup. The strainer, the bowl of the strainer is broken, but that's obviously the intention. So that's even better. But there are plenty of places, obviously, other than Italy in the Roman Empire that were achieving this quality of craftsmanship in silver. We can't date it more closely than probably 2nd or 3rd century AD, nor can we associate it with a known or named individual. We can only surmise, given that it's definitely a luxury item, that he, and I feel it's almost certainly would have been a man, would have been a pretty wealthy individual, probably somebody who travelled and liked to take his cutlery with him in this conveniently portable form. Almost certainly he was somebody who rather liked to show off. You can surely imagine him... Excuse me?
What was the knife blade made of?
Iron. So more suitable for cutting. I mean, they could have made it in silver, but it is in iron, which is normal for knives at this period. So you can imagine somebody, your wealthy traveller, on the Great St. Bernard Pass, some snowy night, sort of in front of the fire at the inn, getting out all the gadgets and generally showing off to the assembled company. However, the fact is that despite our lack of information about it and its consequent limitations as a lecture topic, it's an object that has great popular appeal. Over the last 2 years or so, more than 38,000 people have visited the Roman Swiss Army knife on our website, far more than have visited, I don't know what your numbers are like, but for us that's a huge number of people, far more than have visited any other object in the Fitzwilliam. You know, Monet and Titian are nowhere in this race. So recently I came round rather grudgingly to acknowledging its attraction, and I tried to analyse where this lies. Partly I think it lies in its intrinsic handiness and our appreciation of the combined elegance and functionality of the design, which of course it shares with its modern counterpart, the contemporary Swiss Army knife. There's also the draw of its materials, silver, which makes it very tactile as well as visually beautiful. And beyond this, I suppose it just has a rather timeless quality that generates a feeling of kinship for us with its ancient Roman owners. I mean, few of us are ever going to expect to have a statue made of us, a marble portrait put up in our local town square. But we can all imagine handling an implement like this in our pockets, and maybe even getting out one of the prong to help get the nut out of a walnut or something like that. So it's an object with which we find it easy to make a connection. So when we came to redisplaying our collection, which offers a very selective set of windows onto the ancient Mediterranean world from the Bronze Age to the Roman era, we wanted to think of ways in which we could make our visitors make these sorts of connections between the ancient worlds and their own. Of course, we had many of the normal aims in our arrangement. I should say that the arrangement is basically rather conservatively chronological, because we felt this is how it's going to last, and probably, I don't know how long Carlos hopes his is going to last, but we reckon at least 20 to 30 years before anyone has the energy or the money to redo this sort of arrangement. And with a chronological one, you can basically add anything on that you like. We also were very keen to bring out as much as we could what modern scholarship how it has progressed since it was about 50 years since ours was last comprehensively displayed. So where we can, we've tried to introduce information and draw attention to things like polychromy on sculpture. Unfortunately, most of our sculpture has been rather extensively scrubbed over the 150 odd years that it's been in the Fitzwilliam, but we have done what we can. We wanted people to have an aesthetic experience and to enjoy being in the gallery and to feel that it was a place of beauty where they could see beautiful objects. But we also wanted to try to help people make connections, and we've done this through the chronological sequence, we've tried to talk about people, because we had a feeling that in some ways, some aspects of modern scholarship have tried to sort of airbrush out ancient people and talk as if it was just trends or politics or things like that produced all this art and used it even. So we have tried to put people back into the display. And if this sounds as if it's sort of dumbing down, it isn't at all really. If we're criticised, it's for being too scholarly and having too many words in our gallery. But we've tried to introduce people themes where possible. And by that I mean we talk about the people who made the objects, people who used them. And then also in terms of the object's later history, we've tried to bring in where we have an excavated, a group of objects have been excavated, we talk about that. More often we talk about the collectors who acquired this material. And we also try to bring it up to also talk about curators who've interpreted it, and importantly conservators who may also have had quite an impact on the way the objects look today. So these sorts of themes run through the basically chronological arrangement, which you access by moving in a clockwise direction around the gallery. We probably developed a greater emphasis on collectors than some museums would have done, simply because it seemed like the most obvious way to explain why the collections are as they are, why they are the shape they are today. It isn't a collection that you would end up with if you'd set out to illustrate the ancient Greek and Roman world. It's purely as it is. But so collectors do loom large, but as you'd imagine, some parts of the collection or individual items lend themselves to focus on one people group and others on another. So, for example, one of the key objects in our Bronze Age Aegean section is a Linear B tablet. This was excavated by Sir Arthur Evans at Knossos in Crete, and it was given by him to the Fitzwilliam Museum in 1922. The decipherment of this script in the 1950s and the recognition that the language it's written in is an early form of Greek represented a massive breakthrough for our understanding of the Mycenaean civilization. This particular tablet records a transaction connected with the Cretan perfume industry, noting the transfer of a massive quantity of coriander, which was used as an astringent, between a man named Kyprios, whose name you see in the centre, and a man named Twinone here. The pepper pot sign represents spice, and it refers to coriander, a massive quantity of coriander, 576 litres. Along with thousands of other tablets, this one can help reconstruct the society and the economy of Crete in the late Bronze Age, when the so-called Palace of Knossos functioned as a vast bureaucratic centre for the island's industrial and social organisation. So the main focus of our display of the tablet is its ancient significance and what it meant for the society that produced it. But its more recent history is also of interest and has a particular significance for Cambridge. The person primarily responsible for the decipherment of Linear B was a young architect named Michael Ventris, who tragically died in a car crash in 1956, very shortly after he'd achieved a major breakthrough in the work. His collaborator, John Chadwick, though, was a Cambridge academic who had worked at Bletchley Park during the Second World War, cracking Japanese codes. And for Chadwick, the study of Linear B remained a central core of his research and scholarship until his death in 1998. Interpreting the tablets and assessing their implications for our understanding of Mycenaean society is now an international enterprise, but one in which the University of Cambridge still plays an important part. So it's appropriate that we do have one tablet to display. As you can see, it's an unremarkable object in itself. It's rather like a small bar of chocolate, about 4 inches long. And indeed, for about 50 years, interestingly, it was considered to be a replica, and it was consigned to a drawer in the basement. So it's relatively recently that we've established that it is real, and we've put it prominently on display. At this point, I need to backtrack a little and emphasise again that the Fitzwilliam Museum's Antiquities collections were not part of the museum's founding bequest. The museum was established by the terms of the will of Richard, 7th Viscount Fitzwilliam of Merrion, whom you see here in a portrait by Joseph Wright of Derby that we're lucky to have in our collection. It's quite a modest portrait. He appears to have been quite a modest gentleman. He was educated at Cambridge in the mid to late 18th century, and after that he lived the life of a connoisseur and collector on the continent and in Paris. Unfortunately, from my perspective, he wasn't interested in antiquities. His collections were of old master paintings, prints, drawings, manuscripts, and early printed books. And of all of these, we do have superlative collections in the founding bequest, thanks to him. When he died in 1816, he left all this to the University of Cambridge, along with the then enormous sum of £600,000 to build a museum to house it. And the purpose of the bequest, he wrote specifically, was for the increase of learning. So that's one of the sort of mottos of the Fitzwilliam that we still try and stick to today. The construction of the building itself, and this is the original part of the building where our objects actually live, It was not without incident. The first architect, George Bersavi, fell to his death in the middle of it from a scaffold in Ely Cathedral before he finished the work. And though it wasn't perfectly finished before the 1870s, it opened to the public in 1848, and it's been publicly accessible, freely accessible, not just to members of the university, although it is a university museum, but also to the general public ever since. When you read the contemporary records of the syndicate, which is our form of board of trustees, it's clear that when they started operations in the mid-19th century, they had no idea of expanding the collections in any way. In fact, the ground floor where our collections are now was pretty empty. They received gifts in a rather haphazard sort of way, some of which they came to regret later, notably a large model of the Taj Mahal, which they ended up shunting from one gallery to another and eventually managed to palm it off on the South Kensington Museums with some relief. But they never really thought of buying anything themselves until in 1864 they were suddenly offered the collection that had been formed during his life by Colonel William Martin Leake, who was a sort of a traveller, a soldier, a diplomat, an adventurer, and basically a spy. And he travelled extensively in the Mediterranean in the sort of 1830s, 20s, 30s and 40s. And they offered it for £5,000, and it contained coins, bronzes and Greek vases. And the question aroused intense debate and indeed a lot of rancour in the university. And being a university, they wrote it all down and published printed papers arguing one side or the other, and all got very personal. The problem was the building wasn't finished, and it was thought to be wasteful to spend money on the collections when you hadn't got a staircase in the front hall. But anyway, the decision was eventually taken to go ahead. And this was the foundation of our coin collection, which is one of the great coin cabinets, not just of the UK, but I think of Europe. And it included a fine set of Greek and Roman coins, like this tetradrachm of Naxos here, Greek city in Sicily, and some more intriguing ones like this so-called Olympic medal, which we believe is one of the sort of small series that were issued by the Roman Emperor Severus Alexander in 232 when he held Olympic Games in Thrace, and Alexander the Great, who you see here on his horse, was honoured in these. So I think it was probably a good thing. It was certainly a good thing from my point of view that the museum did agree to buy the Leake collection in the end. Because it included a large number of very fine Athenian black and red figured vases. At present, we don't know where or how Leake collected his Greek vases, but many of them, like this one, are said, like many such vases, to have been found at Vulci in Etruria. And black and red figured vases are among the strengths of our collection, and in different areas of the display we try to present the vases in different sorts of ways. For example, in one section we stress their role in the Greek symposium or drinking party, with cups like this, which have with its very beautiful figure of a banqueter leaning back against his stripy cushion, his bench sagging slightly under his weight. He holds a drinking horn in one hand, and he's perhaps beating time to music in the other. See, he's wreathed for the banquet. This is a musical instrument case hanging up by his side, a very beautifully composed and also very evocative image of a symposiast. Many of the vases do bear scenes that seem to reflect aspects of the lives led by the sorts of people who would have been at the symposium, a gathering of affluent, well-born male citizens. But sometimes even rather ordinary scenes can repay a closer look. This is actually the reverse of a vase that has a slightly more interesting scene on the other side. But although it looks at first sight just like a younger and an older man meeting, I think there's slightly more to it when you look at their faces and their body language. I think there's a story behind this. The young boy is saying something extremely rude to this man, who is looking rather perturbed and is touching his beard in some confusion, and his eye is enormous, as though he's horrified and astonished by what it is the boy is saying. Whether this would have been a scene recognisable to a drinker or not, we don't know. Maybe it would be the sort of scene that might have prompted one of the people at the party to tell a story relating to something from his own experience. But there are many pots like this. It isn't just two draped youths or two people. There is definitely something going on behind this, even if we can't exactly say what. In other areas of the vases display, we try to engage visitors in thinking about how the scenes on vases may have been read in antiquity. Would an ancient viewer, for example, have seen the scene on this pot as an illustration of an episode from the Odyssey, with Odysseus returning home to be greeted by his faithful swineherd, Eumaeus? Or would he have seen it as a cheerful scene of rustic life, or would he have seen it as a reflection of the way in which men are really just like animals, the sort of the small pig greeting big pig and two men meeting? Or maybe all of these could have been involved in the way somebody read the scene. And this, one of my favourite pots, on this scene we have a woman carrying off a young boy with a lyre, probably Eos, the goddess of the dawn, although she's not shown winged, carrying off Kephalos. This is an inversion of the many myths in which men carry off women. So would drinkers have thought this was rather interesting, a joke, or would they have found it rather worrying, perhaps a matter for serious reflection? It's the sort of question you can ask. You don't necessarily have all the answers, but you can suggest such questions are worth asking. This particular vase can also illustrate aspects of later vase scholarship. It's known as the name vase of the Lewis painter. Was painted by an anonymous artist, one whose name we don't know, but he's named after the 19th century owner of this vase, Samuel Savage Lewis, who was a fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and built up a great collection of vases and coins and other items in the second half of the 19th century. Elsewhere in the gallery, we discuss how vases travelled and who facilitated this. In many cases, this is a matter of the physical shipment of vases from Athens to Etruria, and we try to ask sorts of questions. How did the Etruscans, what did they make of these Athenian vases that arrived? But sometimes there are more complicated questions to address concerning the movement of craftsmen or inspirations from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. And that's the case with this vase, where it's a very beautiful vase and worth looking at for its interesting myth scenes, but it's also of interest. We can try and explain the sorts of routes down which modern scholarship is going, how people are trying to work out things about these pots with a pot like this. You see on one side on the left it has a fairly sort of standard Centauromachy scene, which is okay. But this scene is rather more peculiar. It has a figure who does look like a giant, who's holding a big white rock in one hand, and he's much larger than these two warriors. He looks rather like, in his pose, the giant Polyphemus who trapped Odysseus and his crew in his cave. But Odysseus and his companions gouged out the single eye of Polyphemus, whereas these people are attacking the giant more conventionally with spears. But it's also intriguing as to where it was made and by whom. Judging by the clay, it's been assigned to Etruria, so it was made in the west. But there are elements of the decoration, notably these lovely florals and the rather lugubrious birds, who they couldn't resist squeezing a couple in up here and more on the neck, which recall rather Eastern Greek artistry. And so it does raise questions as to how craftsmen were travelling around the Mediterranean at this time. Was it actual people or was it influences and so on? So we can bring up that sort of question in talking about a vase like this. But I suppose one thing I'm particularly interested in is talking about how vases were made and the people who made them. And with an amphora like this, I'm sorry it looks two colours in our two slides, which is just the effect of the lighting. One thing that we have tried to bring out, and I don't think it's going to work terribly well on the slides, is the effect of the so-called preliminary sketch lines, because before the artist used dilute slip to do all the very fine lines on a red-figured vase, he would sketch out the outlines of the figure first using a stick of charcoal. And sometimes if he then changes his mind over where to put the final lines, and if he's pressed too hard with the charcoal, these lines can be preserved, and you can see them with a strong raking light, which is the case in many bits of this vase. And my slide here, maybe you'll be able to see some of them. What you can see perhaps here, that what he did was to draw the horse first, and this is the lower line of the horse's body. And then he drew the young man standing in front. And he drew the young man naked. This is his buttocks here, and the lines of his legs. And then he put his clothes on later. You probably can't see very well, but he changed his mind several times over how to draw the reins. And I think it's very interesting because it gives you a sort of different view of a Greek vase painter at work. And I do urge you, you've got lots of wonderful examples here where you can also see it. It often shows up better on a bigger vase because there seem to be more opportunities for changing your mind, more if you've got more space. But it is worth looking out for because these are the very first and very sketchy and in some ways more fluid, sometimes more fluid lines than those which you end up with. So it is an interesting phenomenon that we try and draw attention to. And we also try to talk in some places, though possibly not completely, I think, successfully, about the effects of more recent conservation on some of our vases. If you have a small vase like this kyathos or dipper, it looks fine, and you have a detail and it looks more or less fine. But if you look at it under ultraviolet light, the sort of differential fluorescence of the materials that are used, and in particular the very brightly fluoresced areas, are all modern paints. And so this raises the sort of dilemma that we have in all collections of Greek vases. What do you do next? Do you take away all the non-ancient bits? Do you just leave it as it is? In a way, you're deceiving the public by letting them think that this is a complete cup. On the other hand, if you take away all the restored bits, they're going to be very distracted by seeing a rather unpleasant and very fragmentary pot. So what do? Do you just accept that this is part of the history of the cup now? There isn't a simple or a single answer to this, but it is, again, something that we thought it was worth occasionally trying to draw the public's attention to. As I said, the Fitzwilliam was very slow to enter the collecting field. It was really only in the early 20th century, with the arrival of a hugely energetic director, Sidney Cockerell, that the museum started to expand in all directions. Sidney Cockerell was famous for saying, having at his epitaph more or less about the Fitzwilliam, "I found it a pigsty, I left it a palace." So whether that's true or not, I don't know. But well before 1848, the University of Cambridge itself had collected quite a lot of sculpture and inscriptions, and these were housed, because the Fitzwilliam Museum didn't exist, in the entrance hall to the University Library. Many of them had been donated by alumni and fellows of the university and its colleges, and in 1865 they were all moved to the Fitzwilliam Museum. Pride of place among them was held by this colossal, battered upper part of a caryatid, an architectural support in the form of a full-length female figure. This was brought back from the sanctuary of Demeter at Eleusis, just south of Athens, by Edward Daniel Clarke in 1803. Clarke was an eccentric and energetic gentleman who eventually became the university's first professor of mineralogy. He believed this was the work of the great classical Greek sculptor Phidias, though most people now consider it carved in the mid-1st century BC. It has to be said that Clarke removed the caryatid very much against the will of the local people at Eleusis, for whom she was a goddess. They believed that she ensured the fertility of their fields, and in fact they piled animal dung up around her to sort of ensure that she kept doing that. And I'm afraid he had to bribe the local priests and carry her off very much against their will. He dismissed their views very arrogantly as ignorant superstition, so it must have been rather pleasing for the Greeks when his mission nearly ended in disaster as the ship carrying this sank off Beachy Head just off the south coast of England on its way back. And the cargo had to be dredged, fortunately without any damage done from the sea floor. Clarke's donations to the university included a number of Greek and Roman inscriptions and other pieces of sculpture, including these three. The figure of Pan is rather nice. It comes from the slopes of the Acropolis. You see, unfortunately, we don't have his head, but there's remains of the beard, his goat-like legs. He's also wearing rather kind of weirdly a goat skin. You see the goat paws hanging down the side there. There's a rather nice lower part of an Aphrodite with a little Eros fragmentary beside her. And this, which he believed was from one of the Parthenon metopes, though actually, again, it isn't. It's from a later Roman building in Athens. This relationship of Roman sculpture to Greek is something that the Fitzwilliam is very well placed to discuss and talk about, because we're very weak in actual Greek sculpture, but we have a great deal of Roman. Of course, the caryatid and her sister, still in Eleusis, are deliberate quotations from the earlier caryatids on the temple of the Erechtheion on the Athenian Acropolis. And this relief does echo the Parthenon metopes. And in both cases, this demonstrates both the continuity between Greek and Roman art and the Roman skill at adapting or reworking earlier types of sculpture to suit their own ends. Another good example of this phenomenon is our Roman version of the Apollo Sauroktonos, or lizard slayer. The original Greek work of the mid-4th century BC that this derives from would almost certainly have been made of bronze and served as a dedication offered by a worshipper in a sanctuary of either Apollo himself or another god. This is a more complete version, but we think less fine, of which is now in the Louvre in Paris, which shows you what the original would have looked like. But on ours, the sinuous curve of the god's body is exaggerated to an extreme degree. And both these Roman versions would probably have been placed in a domestic context, perhaps in the courtyard of a wealthy Roman villa, where they would have served as expressions of taste and connoisseurship. And the Fitzwilliam statue played a similar role in the course of its later history, when it came into the possession of a pair of artists and aesthetes, Charles Shannon and Charles Ricketts, who became major benefactors of the museum in the 1920s and 30s. And as you can see in these photographs, on the left, Charles Shannon with the Apollo as he sits looking at a pile of drawings, and on the right, the Apollo on a pedestal in their elegant sitting room in London. It's clear that Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon lived very comfortably, as do some collectors today, beside and around this statue, appreciating its beauty and doubtless its ancient history, but also very much seeing it as part of their interior decoration and part of their domestic life, along with their fine furniture, etchings and paintings. And I think this later history of the statue is sort of part of the Apollo's history now, as much as its Greek and Roman origins. If not all our Roman sculpture derives so obviously from Greek, but a surprisingly high proportion of it was actually found in a Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire, including this Roman sarcophagus, which is so far the only one of its kind to have been discovered on the island of Crete. How it got there is a mystery. It was certainly made in Italy, almost certainly in Rome, and we suppose it was exported to Crete for the use of a wealthy Roman resident at Arvi on the island's southern coast. The subject is the triumph of Dionysus. It shows the youthful god of wine at the left, returning in triumph from India with a whole lot of new adherents to his cult. Those shown here are his traditional Greek-style entourage of satyrs, the god Pan here. A large satyr takes the central part of the stage. But the processional form of the image and the fact that the god travels in a chariot, and then above all the presence of this very beautiful elephant, whom I have a detail, does evoke, I think, aspects of the ceremonial entry into Rome of victorious Roman generals with prisoners and sometimes wild animals shipped home from foreign lands. The coffin is carved in very high relief, with some of the figures breaking almost completely free from the background. The elephant is a great favourite with our visitors, as you would imagine, and this detail of the elephant's ear with the veins, this is photographed under a strong raking light, shows how very beautiful and realistically the sculptor could carve, which makes it sort of slightly odd really that we don't quite understand why the elephant is cross-hatched in this way, because if he could do elephant ears like that, he could have done the wrinkled skin of the elephant in a more realistic manner. So we're still slightly puzzling over the cross-hatched elephant, and if anyone has any ideas, do let me know. I mean, it's possible he's wearing some form of armour, but seems to end at the ankles, but if elephants have ankles, but I'm not quite sure why it is, because it's a sort of strange contrast with the great realism of the elephant's head and so on. Although it was donated to the University of Cambridge in 1835 by the then Admiral of the British Mediterranean Fleet, Sir Pulteney Malcolm, the sarcophagus is commonly known as the Pashley sarcophagus, after Robert Pashley, a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, who visited, it's named after him partly because he visited Arvi and found a few more bits of the sarcophagus still in the ground, but more really because he worked out how all the pieces fitted together, and he was then the first to publish it in full in a great work he wrote called Travels in Crete. Which this is the frontispiece and one of the illustrations, and I think this shows Pashley. This little drawing is entitled An Evening in a Peasant's Cottage, and it shows him, I think, writing up his journal, and presumably these are the other volumes that he's carrying around with him on his mule, and this is the slightly bewildered gentleman whose house he's staying in, smoking his pipe and watching him. Pashley is rather one of my heroes, much more so than Clark, who I think was rather arrogant and unpleasant probably. Pashley explored Crete in 1833-4, at which point the Greek War of Independence had been won, but Crete was still under the control of the Turks. Pashley was hugely sympathetic to the Cretans and very critical of their Turkish masters. Most of his travels took place in Lent, so while his Cretan hosts were uniformly hospitable, there was no meat and no wine to be had, the standard fare on offer being a dish of herbs, occasionally enlivened with eggs. And when meat was available, it was generally served swimming in oil, as he says, or it turned out to be a preparation of camel's flesh, of which I cannot speak very highly. The weather was atrocious, the roads and paths were frequently swept away by rain and landslides, but Pashley was armed with enormous stamina and determination, besides a formidable knowledge of Greek, of the classics. He left no inscription untranscribed, no coin undescribed, no site unmeasured and assessed. And yet his journal also reveals a very romantic side to his nature. At Knossos, for example, a site which was at that point still awaiting the spade of Arthur Evans, he lingers for ages, and he's desperately keen to find the labyrinth and to recognise in rather shapeless heaps of masonry the remembrance of what the city had been. He talks about these formless heaps of masonry which alone recall to the remembrance of the passing traveller the city's ancient and bygone splendour. And it seems very clear to me, like many travellers before and since, he became deeply immersed in the complete experience of being in Crete, its ancient history, its modern conflicts, the beauty of its landscapes and the generosity of its people who had so little and yet gave him so much. And it ends really when they include him in their great celebration of Easter. So finally, in terms of find spots, I have to return from Crete to Cambridge. And of course, Cambridgeshire was part of the Roman Empire after Britain's conquest by the Emperor Claudius in AD 43. And in theory, our collections don't include finds from Roman Britain, which is covered by another of the Cambridge University museums, that of archaeology and anthropology. This coin celebrates our defeat by the Emperor Claudius. Here you have him in AD 43, and here he is in a victorious chariot saying, De Britannis, we've conquered the Britons underneath. Via fortunate accident, we do hold and display 2 Roman bronze vessels, which I'll show you. A rather nice trefoil-mouthed oinokoi with a siren under the handle, and a bronze patera with a rather fine roundel in the centre, which has a griffin bringing down a stag, and details are picked out in silver. And this is the handle, now separate, with a very fine ram's head. Oops, I'll go back. And these were actually discovered in 1709, just about half a mile down the road from the Fitzwilliam. And the 2 vessels belong to Trinity College, Cambridge, but are on long-term loan to the Fitzwilliam. They're both very finely made, though both now rather battered, particularly the patera. The patera is very fine, apart from the roundel, beautiful frieze of hunting frieze around it, and the bowl is embossed with a lotus bud design, and the ram is also very appealing. Now, these vessels were probably made in Italy, and many similar examples have been found in Pompeii and other Roman sites. And you have upstairs here a wolf head-handled patera. The patera is simple, and it has a very nice wolf head handle. So these are quite common. And until fairly recently, it was assumed that these 2 vessels had been brought from Italy to Cambridge by some fellow or alumnus of Trinity College. But the chance discovery of some early 18th century letters in the British Library has revealed that they were actually found on what was then the edge of Cambridge by workmen digging gravel. The letters were written by a fellow of Queen's College and the man on whose land the find was made, James Thomson. And this is just a detail from James Thomson's letter, which is very circumstantial. And as he says, the history of my antiquities is known to almost everybody here. They were found in the year 1709 by labourers as they were digging for gravel in the extreme part of our bounds, where they joined to those of Cambridge over against Peterhouse College. And this and other details enable us to say pretty precisely exactly where they were found, which was between this milestone, which was actually put up in 1727, and there's another contemporary account of the find which mentions this, 1727. They were put up by Trinity Hall College. This is their coat of arms, and they were it's a great Trinity Hall tradition. One interesting thing about this is the fact that the name Cambridge was actually cut out during the Second World War to confuse any Germans who'd got to within 1 mile of Great St Mary's Church and let them think they were actually in Oxford, I suppose. But anyway, it was sort of between the milestone. Oops, sorry. I want next slide. And the river, which you see here. And there are still gravel pits or remains of sort of sunken pits, so we know pretty much exactly where these were found. The letters also provide descriptions and drawings both of our jug and patera, and of a number of pottery vessels. They helpfully detail a number of potters' names, and so we can work out from those, because a great deal of work has been done on them, that these were potters who were working at La Gros-Fasson in southern France between about AD 40 and 60. So it's just the 2 decades just immediately around and following the Roman conquest of Britain. There was also there's also a drawing of a frame of a hinged gaming board, and the letters describe finding a boar's skull and human bones. So this was definitely the site of at least one grave, and probably one at which feasting and drinking took place as part of the funeral rites. What sort of person might have been buried here? Well, bronze jugs and ram's head handled paterae like this were especially popular grave goods among the wealthy, partially Romanized elites who lived along the northern fringes of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. There are a considerable number of similar finds in southeast England, burials with equipment that included vessels of this type, gaming boards, and evidence for ritual feasting. So like many of the objects in our collection, or indeed in the Mets or any collection, the jug and patera can contribute to our growing understanding of what life was like in southeast England at the time of the Roman conquest. There were people farming lands, keeping pigs, enjoying quite a high standard of living beside the River Cam, importing not just high status vessels but also wine to drink from them. But the contemporary reports of their discovery add another dimension. The letters provide a vivid case study of the way history was literally being made in early 18th century England. They show contemporary awareness of how archaeological discoveries could supplement traditional written histories and chronicles. And they demonstrate how local antiquarians, with their industrious letter-writing habits, were instrumental in extending and preserving knowledge about the past. The story of the find and those associated with it enhances, I think, our connection with these objects. Now, this very short review of the highlights of our collection has led us to travel very rapidly through time and space, from Tivoli to Crete, Athens to Eleusis, back to Cambridge. And I'm aware that there are many aspects of the collection that we haven't had time to touch upon today, from engraved Mycenaean seal stones to miniature Roman portraits, terracottas, one of my interests, and Roman glass. All I can say is I hope I've whetted your appetite for more, and I should have one last slide of the collection, but it doesn't seem to want to appear. There it is. So, as I should say in conclusion, Cambridge is actually much closer to London than most people believe. So do please come and visit us, discover our collections and make your own connections among them. Thank you.